All right, good morning, applied government students. I am not here today. I'm actually around town in Superior, working with the sociology students. We are doing some good community service projects. So that is what I'm up to. What you are up to today is you will be taking notes over punishment, specifically what our Constitution says about what types of punishment are okay. And the thing I've been trying to emphasize in this whole thing is that you have certain rights. Whether you are innocent or guilty, if you are convicted of a crime, or if you're accused of a crime, and even in this case, if you're convicted and found guilty, you still have certain rights. And so we're going to find out what exactly those rights are when it deals with punishment. So first, let me make myself disappear, and let's get on with it. All right. This all boils down to today the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment protects against two very important things. The first is excessive bail or fine, so too much money being paid in legal fees, and then cruel and unusual punishment. What the Founding Fathers wanted to do when they created the Eighth Amendment, they had seen in the past where things like burning people at the stake, if you remember the Salem witch trials, that whole thing, and they had seen these punishments that really didn't fit the crime, and so they created the Eighth Amendment to make sure that when punishment is leveled out, it's going to match, however bad the crime was. A good example actually today of where you might argue that punishment doesn't necessarily fit the crime, in Singapore, there are heavy fines for littering, and the sign I have down there on the left is actually a pretty light punishment, but there are actually very hefty fines in Singapore for littering. You can actually be thrown in prison if you are littering in Singapore. Okay, but so let's talk about bail, because I'm sure bail is a word that you guys have heard of before, but it's not. I don't think it's really a word that we understand. What bail is it's money that the accused can be required to post as a guarantee that he or she will appear in court at the proper time. Money that the accused can be required to post to guarantee that he or she will appear in court at the proper time. So what it is it's basically an insurance. There was a problem for many years in the court system, not necessarily in the United States, but over in England, which is where we get a lot of our laws from, where people would be like, all right, you're going to court on these dates, and then the people just wouldn't show up, and they wouldn't round them up, and maybe they would escape, and so justice would never be served. And so the idea behind bail is if you have to pay money in order to, if you have to pay some money, you're going to make your court date, and the money will be given back to you. It's like a deposit you might pay on a new home, or a deposit when you go to a fancy swimming pool and you put a deposit in for the locker that it won't be misused. If you show up on time, you get your amount repaid, and so there's kind of like this incentive, this incentive to get your money back, and it's supposed to encourage you to show up to your court date on time. And like I said below, it's used to prevent runaway criminals, and usually bail is set at a price equal to the crime. So if you committed some small petty theft, some very small crime, you may not even have bail, or maybe you have bail, but maybe it's in the hundreds of dollars, something very small. Now, if you commit more serious acts, your bail can be set at a very high price. Many investors who committed fraud in the stock market, their bail can be set at hundreds of thousands of dollars to ensure that they won't leave. Although there have been cases where, there's one in particular that comes to mind where somebody did actually pay the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they still had all the extra money, and so they flew the coop anyway. But we'll get more into that actually in the next slide. So let me get to the problems with bail. One of the problems we see with bail is that people will jump bail. That's that case that I talked about, where somebody may pay their bail, but they still don't come back. And that's when you jump bail. And this is definitely a very serious issue, although I would say this is more of an issue among wealthier Americans. For the poor, a bigger issue is sometimes even those very small bail amounts are set too high. And what oftentimes happens, just to give you an example, sometimes you will see a situation where bail may be set at a few $100s. Let's say it's set at $500. Well, that's still a very steep amount of money. I wouldn't want to pay $500. I can afford it, but let's just say somebody who makes less than I do, they may not be able to afford the $500. And if you can't pay bail, you have to go to prison until your court date. And many people, there's a good amount of people who, instead of paying bail, do go to prison for a little while. But some people who don't want to go to jail and don't want to pay the bail would rather just plead guilty to a crime, even if they are innocent of the crime. They would rather plead guilty to it and not spend any time in prison, just have that little mark on their record, than pay the money or go to prison. It's a very interesting situation. And there are a lot of different alternatives being proposed about how to maybe do bail better, but it's an interesting thing that our criminal justice system has to work out, and probably something that you will hear in the next few years, something that we will be trying to figure out. A big problem that the United States actually has right now is we have an overcrowded prison population, and there's a lot of different talks about how we can reduce our prison population, because the United States actually has the largest prison population of any country in the world, and far ahead of those of other developed countries. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Alright, something that a judge can do is initiate preventive detention. And preventive detention is where you hold the accused without any bail on the belief that they may commit a crime before the trial comes. It's very controversial because this always happens before somebody is proven guilty, and this is assuming that the person is guilty. However, the Supreme Court has determined that this is constitutional, and there are good examples where we can think of where this would be very useful. A good example is James Holmes. I don't know how many of you remember the theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, but James Holmes would be a good example. He was arrested. He had not yet had his trial. And so he didn't get any bail. He was held in prison, since as a murderer there was concern that he may commit other crimes, or that he may even flee if he was not put into prison. And so that is a good case of preventive detention. You are preventing future crimes or preventing somebody from fleeing by holding them in prison. Okay, but let's get down then to the cruel and unusual punishment part. We've talked about bail, we've talked about the excessive fines. What about you're found guilty, the punishment? The cruel and unusual punishment is something that the Eighth Amendment prevents. And again, like I mentioned before, the Founding Fathers had in mind their history, and they saw all the different terrible ways in which people were punished for wrongdoing. In fact, after the Constitution was passed in the United States, in Britain it was still very common for people to be quartered, which, if you want to know what quartering is, take a look at that picture up in the top right-hand corner, as that man is about to be split into 4 different pieces. Or sometimes they would do hanging and then quartering, which was a little bit more humane, but still. You get the point. They were trying to prevent quartering, trying to prevent burning at the stake, crucifixion, basically these extreme forms of punishment that they considered to be inhumane. However, the Supreme Court today has allowed most punishments to stand. This includes, interestingly enough, things like the electric chair that the Nebraska Supreme Court ruled a cruel and unusual punishment about 7 or 8 years ago. But the Supreme Court has held that firing squad is an acceptable form of punishment. They have allowed lethal injection. In fact, almost every time that a case has come before the Supreme Court asking, is this cruel and unusual punishment, the Supreme Court has ruled that no, it is not cruel and unusual punishment, especially when it comes to the death penalty, but we'll get to that in a second. I have the samplings down here of different rulings that the Supreme Court has made. You can attempt an execution the second time if the first time fails. The case in particular somebody had been strapped to the electric chair. They fired the electric chair off. He did not die. And they decided, okay, we want to go and do this again because his punishment is death. And the Supreme Court said, yes, if it does not kill him the first time, he is allowed to be killed the second time. That's not double jeopardy. That's not cruel and unusual punishment. Other things, a narcotics addiction is not a crime. And I should put, yes, no, never mind, that is correct. A narcotics addiction is not a crime. There used to be a time period where we gave out punishments for purely being addicted to something. The addiction in and of itself is no longer treated as a crime, but abuse of narcotics, of course, is still a crime. All right, now let's get down to capital punishment, which for us in Nebraska this year especially is very important because in November of this upcoming year, those of you who will turn 18 by that point will get to vote on whether or not Nebraska should have a death penalty. The capital punishment is just a death penalty. It's just punishment by death. That's all we mean when we say capital punishment. And the Supreme Court, and I've talked about this before, the Supreme Court has upheld the death penalty in numerous cases and in various forms. And so the death penalty is constitutional. It's not cruel and unusual punishment. There are restrictions. You can't put the death penalty on people who are mentally ill. They need to receive treatment. You can't put the death penalty on any crime where the victim did not die. And you might be like, okay, well, yeah. But what used to happen for a long time was that if somebody was convicted of rape, they would receive the death penalty. And the Supreme Court has ruled that that is too much. And you must also be 18 years or older for the death penalty. There used to be laws where children could receive the death penalty in our country. The Supreme Court has since ruled that that is unconstitutional and that is cruel and unusual punishment. If you look over to the right, I have a nice little map that comes from the Death Penalty Information Center, and that shows you, as of July 1st of last year, and I believe that this is still up to date, the different states that have death penalties and states that don't have death penalties. The ones in red do have death penalty still. So Kansas has the death penalty. The ones in light blue, including Nebraska, do not have the death penalty. And the ones that are in purple, they have a death penalty in the books, but their governors have basically put a temporary ban on it. Okay, and I want to talk about the two sides of the death penalty debate, especially since in Nebraska we will be voting on this. If you are for the death penalty, here are kind of the big issues on your side. There's always the issue of justice. You want justice for the victims of the families. If somebody takes a life, the idea of justice is since you take a life should be taken away. You've taken away a life, you have lost your own right to live. And that goes on to the next part. It's a morally acceptable punishment because there was already a life taken. There is also an argument that the death penalty is a deterrent. A deterrent is something that prevents things from happening. And so there's an argument that the death penalty prevents future crimes. If you know that the punishment for a certain crime is death, maybe you'll be less likely to use it. Or to do it, I mean. What's also important is for those who are for the death penalty, most believe that it is only acceptable in extreme cases, and that's why murder or mass murder, these are the people that death penalty supporters want to receive the penalty. And right now in our country, 61% of Americans do support the death penalty and 37% do not. It's interesting because the opinion in our country changes a lot depending on what happens. If crime starts really picking up, suddenly the amount of people in favor of the death penalty goes way up. But if there are less issues of crime in our country, then suddenly support goes down. You'll see in the mid-1960s, there was actually more people opposed to the death penalty than there were people who supported it. And it's an interesting thing in our country. We are not very set on our position on this issue, but most of the time we tend to be in favor of the death penalty. Now, if you oppose the death penalty, there are basically two main ideas that go on here. First, is that the death penalty is not moral. There's this idea that the death penalty creates a cycle of vengeance, and what we mean by that is it's revenge versus revenge. So like if somebody killed a member of your family, you're turning around and getting revenge on them by using the government to kill a member of their family, and so then their family might turn around and seek, vengeance. And so in other words, like this revenge thing might happen back and forth. On a similar topic, people argue that killing, even if it is done by the government, is still murder. There's a big argument to be had that just because you say you are doing it for justice doesn't mean that it's necessarily right. Then there's kind of another argument. So you kind of have the moral argument that killing even of a murderer is not right. Some actually argue that it's too easy. Anyway, but there's that argument. Then there's also this other camp that argues about the cost. And the cost of carrying out the death penalty is higher than having somebody spend their life in prison. And this is actually true. In Nebraska, when this was debated, the reason the legislature got rid of the death penalty in 2015 mostly was because of the cost. There were some people who legitimately thought that the death penalty was not moral, but there was a good amount of conservatives who felt that because the cost was so much, it didn't make sense for us to be spending so much money on murderers. Here's an estimate up here. This is actually for how much the death penalty costs the state of Kansas. It's estimated that one person on death row that ends in the death penalty costs Kansans $1.2 million, whereas the cost of that person throughout their life, if it just ends with life in prison, costs $740,000. And I mean, those are those are still huge amounts of money, but obviously one is almost half of the other. One other very important problem is that the people who get the death penalty tend to be poor and minorities. More often than not, a white person who commits a crime will get punished but will not get the death penalty, whereas somebody who is poor or somebody who is an ethnic minority is more likely to get the death penalty. In fact, there is a disproportionate amount of African Americans who receive the death penalty than white people. And so that's another argument against the death penalty, is maybe it's justified, but in practice, maybe it favors one group of people over another. Alright, that is it. Let's go over the quick recap questions. Somebody tell me what bail is. And then somebody tell me what we have for limits on capital punishment. Your funnies for today. Take time to be a dad today, before you're murdered. Always the saddest part of The Lion King. On the topic of cats, I think mine might be getting a little too fat. And finally, since the cat theme continues, you all maybe have experienced this before. Alright, if there's any time left at the end of the period, I would like you guys to be watching CNN Student News. Otherwise, I will be back tomorrow. Tomorrow is the Wisconsin primary, and so that'll be really interesting to see if Donald Trump can pick up the win there or if Ted Cruz can stop him. Bernie Sanders is favored over Hillary Clinton. But other than that, if you have any questions on anything, I will be back at the end of school today, so you can talk to me then. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day.